Welcome to this special meeting of Council to consider the local plan. Apologies.
Yes, Chair. We've received apologies from councillors Deborah Botham, Martin Burfoot, Sue Burfoot, Richard Fitzherbert, Helen Froggatt, Tony Millwood, Gary Purdy, Irene Ratcliffe, Mark Salt and Philippa Tilbrook.
Councillors, as you will know, Councillor Millwood is currently in hospital and there is a card being passed around which would be good if you could sign it, please. If we move now straight into public participation, as you know, you've got 3 minutes each to talk, those that have registered, and if you could restrict your subject to the subjects we're actually discussing at this special meeting. So it sort of varies slightly from the usual council meeting where you can raise a whole number of issues. So if I could call the first speaker, Mrs. Vicky Rains. Do you want me to give you a 30-second warning when you're... If you get that far. Okay. Thank you. When you're ready.
Thank you. The absence of district councillors at the local plan hearings was noticeable. The decision of councillors have taken to select so few settlements for development is unforgivable. The planned unsustainable growth will change communities beyond recognition. Development is being imposed without concern or for lack of everyday facilities or infrastructure. To use the government as an excuse for this council's decision is also unacceptable. Locations for development were ratified by this council. This council decided not to disperse development more evenly throughout the plan area. Tansley Parish Council do not endorse MM3 or MM4 of the modifications. We do not accept your flawed hierarchy which does not stand up to intelligent scrutiny or the meaningless modifications. At the summing up of the hearings, the inspector said that the sustainability appraisal needed modification. He also said the sustainability appraisal should be publicised in conjunction with the MMs and go out for public consultation. The inspector said he wanted to see all representations from the 6-week consultation. We are concerned that the officer's report fails to mention that the sustainability appraisal needs to go out to consultation with the MMs and wonder if once again this process has become less than transparent. Tansley Parish Council will bring these concerns to the attention of the inspector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Rains. Mr. Ian Strange. Sorry, could you switch on the microphone? Or you have to press, if you press the button.
Sorry about that. I was looking at the red light below. Yeah. On page 12 of the report, limited facilities have been changed to some facilities. I think this is wrong, particularly for Tansley. It should be very limited facilities for Tansley, as we have no shop, no medical facilities, and an infrequent bus service. The post office comes for 2 hours once a week. We have 3 public houses, which are really restaurants, to which a lot of the non-residents travel by car. A small primary school. Also, but we have got electricity and water. Surely Tansley should be in Tier 4, not Tier 3. My other point is that Tansley asked the inspector if he would remove the allocated site called Whiteley Nursery. I cannot find anything in the report regards this. The 27 houses are proposed. There is 123 houses proposed with planning permission passed by this authority in the Tansley parish. This further 27 would severely overload our heavily congested village street. The only other access to the site is, as you all know, the narrow lane with passing places leading to the top of Slag. Therefore, the majority of the extra traffic would come down the village and join the busy A615. I ask you to consider taking this site out of the local plan to help us cope with what we can help us cope with what we can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. John Ewart.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman and Councillors, I believe it's important to review the situation we are all in the context of the framework and of the CPRE's view on the framework presented to the House Select Committee recently. Before moving to that, firstly, I find it difficult to say anything new for my clients and colleagues in the absence of the Inspector's draft report. We don't know what his thinking is. So meanwhile, I just reconfirm my regret that DCC's intention to review Watery Lane has not been followed up, that the policy for the A515 bypass is weakened by the proviso, that no provision has been made for a new village, that no allowance has been made for the fact that half the housing area is not in the planning area, that no allowance has been made for the reduction of the OAN, and that the housing site for 450 houses at the Wells is still in. I find it odd that having reduced the OAN significantly, Wells is still in. And the only credible grounds I can see for that is to give the authority more choice. But that's not needed now, given that the essential 5-year supply at least has been met without the Wells. It also runs against the widely accepted and promoted view that brownfield land should be developed first. DDC can choose to follow that policy if it wishes. Wells should only be allocated when harmful and beneficial sites, less harmful and beneficial sites are exhausted. Secondly, that brings me to the wider view and the longer time frame. The framework is entirely the creation or the creature of the Conservative administration. The original version was tamed a lot by the social and environmental voice, but the current framework, as CPRE has proved factually, is not working. It provides mainly for people who already have homes. It promises to supply homes, affordable homes. It promises to supply affordable homes are often broken nationwide. Permissions are not built. There are enough brownfield sites locally and nationally to meet most of the need, but that's not enforced. When the nation was poorer, in the 70s and 80s, but more equal, hundreds of thousands of houses were built every year, over half of them social housing funded by the Housing Corporation. In the 90s and the noughties, regional, national and EU agencies funded derelict land repair.
You have half a minute.
Thank you. The point of saying all this is that I feel we should be cautious, you should be cautious, we should all be cautious, given that there is political shift going on at the moment, and that there may well, before very long, be a review of the framework. I suggest the LPA, the authority of the council, limit its firm allocations to a 5-year supply until the framework has been adjusted. I give the link, Chairman, to the CPRE's paper that went to the Select Committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Mrs. Julie Atkin.
Thank you. Can I just clarify a couple of acronyms and abbreviations that I'm going to use before I start, please?
That would be helpful.
For members who don't know.
Thank
so
you.
WAG is Wolds Action Group, for those of you who don't know, and AM is just additional modifications. The OAN has been reduced to 5,680, yet the plan's total provision has risen to 6,684. That's a 17.6% over provision. Other planning authorities accept a 5% buffer and some even have a shortfall. The council's therefore keeping in the Wolds an unsustainable site as an insurance policy. And this is highly controversial, especially in view of the national park constraints and the Lewes model precedent. It lays current residents of Matlock wide open to being overwhelmed by an excess of housing in an unsuitable location. AM35 talks about the deliverability of sustainable transport networks. WAG has clearly and robustly demonstrated the unsustainable nature of Wolds in this regard, yet continues to be ignored. The Council's investigation into the traffic impacts of this huge site has been inadequate. We have shown that emergency vehicles already struggle to access Cavendish Road. Evidence was submitted to WAG by a paramedic. To bring yet more traffic into this locale is to put public safety at risk. The proposed link road will not, as claimed by developers, alleviate congestion and accessibility at the Wellington Street Cavendish Road junction. The public does have local knowledge and it shouldn't any longer be ignored. At considerable expense, WAG commissioned Sanderson Consulting Engineers to undertake an overview of the Wolds traffic, and they observed queues well in excess of those predicted on their short visit last November. As for transport assessments, AM35, incentives such as discounts on trainers and bikes, quote from the Thornbury's development in Matlock, are all very well, but won't stop people from getting into the car. You all know such expectations are unrealistic and unachievable in that location. AM14 talks about the importance of tourism to the economy of the Dales. Yes, it's essential, but this overdevelopment of Matlock will destroy tourism in the town. It's already got a reputation for long queues, and tourists won't carry on tolerating them. They're likely to stay away. AM15 talks about catering for the predicted 46% rise in the over 65s. Wolds is unsuitable for an ageing population, yet AM19 continues to preclude Darley Dale, which has better transport links, it's flat with
left.
Good facilities. Okay. In an attempt to justify the overdevelopment of Matlock and limit that in Darley Dale, there's extensive reference to Joseph Whitworth, AM8, but nowhere is John Smedley mentioned, who put Matlock on the tourist map as a spa town. What assurance can the council give the people of Matlock that developers won't just cherry pick the prettiest sites, destroying the landscape that they are promoting in their sales pitches, and which you state in your local plan you are protecting? According to council's figures, with commitments and permissions, there is in excess of a 7-year supply already in place.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Fred Burgess.
Don't get old, Mr. Chairman.
Should have warned me about that earlier. No. That's all right. Can you switch your microphone on? There you are.
Thank you very much.
3 minutes. I'll
Yes.
warn you when you've got 30 seconds
Thank
left.
you very much. Do you ever get in a situation where someone has just said exactly what you were going to say? Julie and I were in my house this afternoon wondering what we were going to say, so I'm just going to do a few bullet points and leave it at that, if I may. The first one was, I went to the annual general meeting of the CPRE on, that's the Campaign for Rural Preservation, on Saturday, and actually lunch was provided, but I went with Norman and we decided we would go to the meeting, but I was too old to be wandering around Carsington Water for an hour, so we thought we'd go to the meeting and then speak to the chairman. And then anyway, we had raised a point that they had issued quite a very decent coloured leaflet some time ago, and it dealt only with Snitterton. It was very nice indeed. It said what was wrong with the council, why on earth they had to develop Snitterton, but no mention of Wolds Rise. So we took the opportunity, Norman is here and he's a member, he took the opportunity to telephone one of them, and when we got there on Saturday, they had put that right. There was another good paragraph in their latest thing, and the chair of the National Campaign for Preservation has been to see Wolds Rise, and she said that she thought that it was just as strong a case as Snitterton for not even being considered for housing. That's my bullet point there. They also issued a very good pamphlet on roads generally, and that was about new roads, bypasses and improvements to roads. And they had made the point very strongly indeed that every time you build a road, it sort of breeds traffic. And everywhere you put housing sites all around the area, those sites themselves breed cars, and so you've got a massive breeding situation taking place. All these cars get onto the motorway and they all go somewhere or another and come back, and the cars keep breeding. It's almost as though they were animals. So they are looking at the whole question of roads, and they're going to Highways England and see if they can suggest any way in which the impact of cars on landscape and other developments can be softened. That's in being now, and that follows, of course, on what Julie was saying about roads generally. Only 40 seconds. Yeah, I think I'd like to deal with off-street parking for the 40 seconds. When I was at the public inquiry, and at times I was the only member of the public there, in fact, poor Mr. Wilson and I carried it between us. I know I've only got 40 seconds, but I think you councillors ought to have your backside slapped for sending this chap into the... Well, I thought he was hang out to dry, to use an RAF expression, but I mustn't spend any more time on it. That's not part of my 40 seconds, that's a complimentary. Thank you. But I do want to say, though, that we have submitted a lot of information to the inspector, and we have measured all the things we've talked about. And at the moment, Cavendish Road is a nightmare. I feel that sooner or later there's going to be a nasty accident there, and that one of the care homes or something like that is going to either catch a light. And you've got to remember what's happened in London recently. Nobody foresees these things, and if you needed emergency vehicles to get there in a hurry, they would not be able to do so because of that wretched cul-de-sac when you come off Smedley Street. That better be my 40 seconds, then. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Yes, you are. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all of you spoke. That would be very useful, and some of the points will be picked up by Paul Wilson when he talks more generally. I know he's taken copious notes. Thank you very much for that. Any interests from councillors to be noted? Yes.
Just on that point, Chair, as this is a discussion on modification, should any particular site emerge as part of the discussion where previously a member has declared an interest, they will need to declare that interest at that time and act appropriately. That is still a possibility at this stage.
Thank you very much. So, can I hand over to Paul Wilson to talk about the paper and the modifications and how they will be dealt with?
Thank you, Chairman. Well, members, the report outlines the process that we have followed to date. Members will be aware that the examination in public into the local plan commenced on the 9th of May, and it sat for 8 days in total, and those hearing sessions finished on the 23rd of May. The inspector's role in this process really is to test the soundness of the local plan. He's also duty-bound to consider whether we have satisfied the legal duty to cooperate and whether the plan is legally compliant in terms of the various regulations which are laid down by government. Clearly, that process was a very detailed process, and indeed all of the speakers who have spoken this evening attended that examination at various points in time and made very similar representations to those that they have raised again this evening. Now, clearly, we are yet to receive the inspector's report, and nobody can second guess what the inspector will say within that report. But the process that we have to follow this evening is to consider the modifications which the inspector has notified through his consideration of the evidence to date, both during and following the examination, and identify modifications which the inspector considers would be necessary in order to make the plan sound. So that is completely without prejudice to his findings on all of the evidence he's heard throughout the hearing sessions, and it is also without prejudice to public representations which may be received in regard to these modifications. But the schedule of modifications before members this evening is therefore very much focused on those issues which the inspector has identified to date. and it is on the basis that they are presented to Council for consideration in order that the public can have an opportunity to express their views and opinions on them. However, at this stage, it is not an opportunity to revisit the plan. All of the points regarding whether sites should be included or excluded, that was the process of the examination in public itself. We are past that point in time now. The inspector will now only consider additional representations if they relate to the modifications which are to be published for public consultation. Now, in regard to that schedule, members will see that there are three schedules attached. The first one is the main modifications, and these are the modifications which the inspector will consider in detail and arise from his consideration of the evidence. The second schedule relates to additional modifications. They will not be considered by the inspector, and they are of a very minor nature and deal with minor tidying up exercises in order to make sure the plan reads consistently across its entirety. And the third schedule relates to changes to the policies, maps and diagrams, and again that is the spatial expression of any changes which arise from the main modifications document. Now, the recommendation is that members approve those main modifications and that they are subject to public consultation for a period of 6 weeks. And subject to member approval this evening, we are in a position to commence that consultation next Monday, the 3rd of July, and that will run until the 24th of August. The programme thereafter will be that the District Council will receive those public representations. We will not consider them in further detail, but they will be forwarded on to the inspector for the inspector's consideration, and he will take them into account in the formulation of his main report. I anticipate that that main report would be received by the Council in September, at which point Council would need to meet to consider its response to that, and at that point hopefully we'll then move towards adoption, which I would anticipate to be around October time. So that is the process that we are looking to follow. Chairman, following the publication of the agenda, the inspector has notified the Council of further minor changes which he would wish us to incorporate into the modifications document, and I would like to update members in terms of the nature of those, and I will refer to the actual modification references. The first one relates to modification MM16, and this is a technical change which increases the amount of employment land designated within the district from 15 hectares to 24 hectares. The second modification relates to MM23, and that relates to a policy which looks to safeguard and protect trees on development sites, and the inspector has proposed alternative wording for the third paragraph of that particular policy. The third change relates to modification MM28. Again, this is a technical modification. The inspector has requested the inclusion of Ashbourne Airfield Phase 1 into the allocations because that site has now been granted planning permission. The fourth change relates to a correction of an error in policy EC7, which is to include Matlock Bath as a settlement which has designated primary shopping frontages. And the fifth and final change requested relates to the policies map reference PM10, and it is the inclusion of Fanny Shaw playing fields within the settlement framework boundary for Wirksworth. All five of those have arisen in the process of continued dialogue between the authority and the inspector following the publication of the agenda, and again subject to council approval they will be incorporated into the schedules to be published on Monday. Turning to points raised by the speakers, Chairman, in terms of the issue raised by Mrs Rains and the sustainability appraisal, members will see that within Appendix 1, the fourth paragraph of the covering sheet on page 7, it makes specific reference to the sustainability appraisal, which is a document published alongside the main modifications and again will be published on Monday in full. In regard to points raised by Mr Strange and the issues regarding the designation of Tansley and the tier within the hierarchy, that was an issue discussed in detail at the examination, and we should await the views of the inspector rather than try to second guess what the inspector may or may not do in respect of that particular matter. Evidence was also considered regarding Whiteley's nursery, and again there is no modification because we do not know what response the inspector is likely to give to those representations. In regard to the points raised by Mr Ewart regarding the Watery Lane site, the County Council, the lack of a village settlement in the south of the district, and also reference to the A515, again all issues raised and evidence presented to the inspector at the examination, and we should await the inspector's findings on that. In regard to points raised by Mrs Atkins and the issue of the OAN and the inclusion of Wolds Rise, it is true that the evidence presented by the Council sought a reduction in the OAN based upon latest population projection information. The inspector has agreed to the publication of a modification in that respect, but again we don't know what the inspector's response will be to the proposed allocations. The inspector may well decide that in light of a reduced OAN, that will result in a reduction in the number of site allocations. So we should await the inspector's views rather than try to second guess that particular process. And finally, in regard to Mr Burgess's points, again many of those were discussed at the examination. The CPRE did not submit any representations to the examination, and therefore any representations cannot be submitted at this point in time on the substance of the local plan.
Excuse me. No, you've had your sorry, you've had.
Something's been said about what I said, and it's quite untrue. I was at the meeting on Saturday, and
Can you?
gave evidence at the inquiry said that she thought it was enough to make a written representation, so she didn't add very much more.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
That does not add up to what Mr. Wilson
Thank you.
was saying. I'm sorry. This happened to me before when I tried to argue with Mr. Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And
No, I will not. Sorry, please can you sit down? Mr Burgess, can you sit down?
What is it, Mr. Wilson?
I don't want any more interruptions, otherwise we'll have to adjourn the meeting. Is that understood? Thank you. Would you like to continue, Mr Wilson?
Thank you, Chairman. In regard to the modifications now presented, there are two significant issues which I wish to draw to Council's attention. The first relates to the issue of the OAN at modification MM12, and it is the reduction in the OAN from 6440 to 5680. That clearly is a reduction in terms of the overall requirements, but there is no evidence from the inspector to date to indicate that there should also be a corresponding reduction in site allocations, but that does not stop the inspector reflecting upon that and making any reductions within his report should he deem that to be necessary. The second main change relates to modification MM42, and that is the incorporation of 2 new employment sites within the district, again based on evidence presented at the hearing sessions, and this very much supports the District Council's priority to boost employment growth and job creation. Aside from those 2 modifications, Chairman, the vast majority of the modifications are of a very minor nature. I think members can see from the nature of those by considering the documents. They are modifications which seek to better reflect national planning advice or based upon the inspector's assessment of how policies should be worded. And on that basis, Chairman, I'm happy to take any further questions.
Thank you. Councillor Rose.
Chairman, I think we're all conscious that we've been debating matters local plan for some considerable period of time, and I would certainly like to pay tribute to those behind me who have maintained a consistent and polite campaign to try and get things changed, and I hope for their sake they've had some success with the inspector. And clearly, from our own point of view, Mr Wilson and his team, I know he's been without Mike for some time, but he's gradually coming back, has done a fantastic job in very trying and difficult circumstances, particularly during the inquiry. So I think we must thank all those who have played their part in this so-called, and I use the word advisedly, so-called democratic system of deciding a district's local plan, because I think I've said before and I'll say again that most of us feel that we've got our hands tied behind our backs when it comes to complying with government instructions as to numbers and the need to have more houses. And I don't want to argue with Mr. Ewart, but I don't think you can just blame one party for the desire to get more housing built here, there and everywhere. It seems to be a consistent theme across the board, unless you're promising the earth. And that's not going to happen. We have to be realistic here. So I'm going to move the recommendation, Chairman, as amended by Mr. Wilson in what he has just said, because I think here we are being instructed, is probably the right word, instructed by the inspector to accept these modifications. He has put them forward. He expects them to be accepted, and the consequences spelled out in Mr. Wilson's report that if we don't accept them, we can expect some trouble, and so that we have to take this step. And it's a formal step, and some members might feel frustrated by this process. What are we doing here? We can't make a decision. The inspector's telling us what to do. Well, he is, and we have to accept it. And we have to perhaps hope that the inspector, when he does submit his report, may have taken into consideration some of the genuine concerns that have been expressed over a number of years consistently by a number of people. That is not in our hands tonight. I wish it was, but it isn't. So, Chairman, I'll move the recommendations as amended.
Thank you, Councillor Rose. Councillor Catt?
I will echo those sentiments, second the motion, and reserve the right to speak should I wish to later in the debate.
You're right. Councillor Morley?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it's just, again, it's echoing that sentiment, and thank you very much indeed to the members of the public who are clear, erudite and constructive in their comments, and I'm sure they will remain engaged with the process going forward into the review period. The question for Mr. For Paul, I'm looking at the OAN there. You've got it down from 6440 to 5680. We've been working for 6440 for a long time. I make that a reduction of some 12%. Is that about right?
Yes, Chairman, it is in that order.
Thank you. The next question is supplemental. And are we in danger of, that's a pretty tough negotiation, are we in danger of losing you to Mr. David Davis and his Brexit negotiation team?
I'm not sure my abilities would extend to that type of negotiation, Chair.
Councillor Pawley?
Yes, I just wanted a bit of clarity, if that's possible, on two things. The policy EC2, page 109, the addition of the Pisani site at Cromford has got a B2 use on it. Is that an existing use? Is Pisani's work there already B2?
Yes, Chairman, it is.
Thank you very much. And the second one was, could you just tell me what in real terms the designated primary shopping frontage means? I haven't a clue what that is.
Okay, there is a policy within the town centres which seeks to safeguard what are termed primary shopping frontages. These are the frontages which primarily contain just use class A1 retail shops. It doesn't include takeaways or financial and professional services, estate agents and the like. And the purpose of the policy is to safeguard a dominance of A1 retail uses within those defined frontages. So it seeks to safeguard and protect the core of the town centres by maintaining a percentage of A1 only uses, such that other uses, i.e. financial, professional, takeaways and the like, would be very much on the periphery of the town centre.
Well, you can expect, I can say that. I'm very glad to hear that. Thank you.
Councillor Radcliffe?
Thank you, Chair. Can I just begin by echoing what I picked up as congratulations to you, Paul, from Mr. Burgess, and just ask that you pass them on to Mike Hayes and, of course, everybody who has helped with the preparation of this plan, but you particularly for your involvement with the local inspection, and the representation that you've given to Derbyshire Dales, this council and the residents in general over bring this important strategic document forward. You certainly, I think, deserve our thanks for that. I was one of those, incidentally, that had very strong concerns and anxieties about certain inclusions of land inclusion, and I still have those thoughts about the suitability of it, but I was content at the time and still am with the process that is going forward, because I know that they have the final hurdle, of course, of planning approval, and as you quite rightly have said this evening, they are still subject to the inspector's final report. But can I just ask you just to indulge me on a hypothetical question regarding this these figures there and the flexibility of the 17% against the working increase of the 5% that was presented to us, and indeed the figure that often cropped up in planning reports when other developments were being considered. If the inspector deems that we should reduce that figure, is there a likelihood of land allocations being withdrawn?
Yes, there is. If I can perhaps provide a bit more context to this. Very early on in the examination process, even before we got to the hearing sessions, the authority was involved in an exchange with the inspector in terms of his preparation, and at that point the inspector identified that based upon the figure of 6440, there was only 3% flexibility in our housing provision, and the inspector was clearly concerned about that given the nature of many of the sites which we're bringing forward for allocation. You know, there are very large brownfield complex sites to be developed, and with flexibility of 3%, we are basically saying that you are having to guarantee delivery on every single one of those sites within the time frames that we are looking at. Now clearly that may not be achievable, you hope that it is, but it may not be. Now the government white paper produced before the election gave a very strong indication that authorities should actually be looking at 20% flexibility on its housing delivery, and there are likely to be measures come forward in the future if the proposals in the white paper find their way into national policy advice and legislation, which will require a monitoring regime along those particular lines. So whilst I don't think we can second guess what the inspector's response is likely to be on the issue of the extent of allocations, clearly 17% flexibility is far more of a healthy position to be in and gives the plan more chance of being found to be sound than a 3% flexibility would have done. But it is within the inspector's remit to actually reduce the number of allocations based upon the evidence that he has heard.
Thank you. As always, you give a very detailed response. Can I ask you another couple of questions and point out what I feel is a possible error too that you might wish to take into consideration? It's only a small one, but in terms of the documentation, it should be accurate, of course. My question really is in point of clarification, as it were. We appear, at first reading, to my mind, to be losing, or at least having to accept some strong modifications to policy S1, which is the presumption in favour of sustainable developments. That's the first one that's mentioned on the schedules, the appendix. And the second one that caught my attention was changes to policy PD2, protecting the historic environment. My question to you really is, why have those modifications come about? What was the reasoning there? And do you feel that they could have an impact, particularly the second one, about relaxing developments that might have an impact upon Derbyshire Dales built heritage?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. In regard to policy S1 and modification MM2, that has been deleted in its entirety. The reason being because it duplicated almost word for word what is in the national framework. And the inspector felt that was not necessary because the national framework still stands as a decision maker. Yes, you still have to have regard to it, so it was unnecessary duplication within this plan. So that was the reason for that one. In regard to policy PD2 and modification 20, there was a lot of debate on this issue, and the inspector was keen to ensure that there is an appropriate balance between the need to accommodate and facilitate new development against the need and desire to protect the historic environment. And the inspector felt that the policy as originally worded didn't quite get the balance right. So he has sought to introduce more balance, which gives greater opportunity for the decision maker to weigh different factors in consideration in determining a particular proposal.
My next question, if you'll allow me, relates to the identification of a net need of 500 bed spaces for registered care provision for older persons. I particularly welcome that because I've entered the third age myself. Now, these 500 are referred to in policy HC11, but there's no specific mention of where they might arise. Are we, as it were, simply dependent upon speculation, as it were?
Yes, the 500 bed spaces that are referred to, they aren't use class C3 residential type uses. They are referred to as use class C2. So you wouldn't seek to allocate sites for the provision of, in effect, care home type accommodation. So what the policy does, it acknowledges the fact that the evidence is indicating a need for 500 bed spaces. It's also indicating that the council will support proposals that come forward for C2 use developments, nursing homes and the like, sheltered accommodation, but it will be very much for the market to deliver those particular bed spaces and certainly the locations of them. So this is a supportive policy rather than a very prescriptive policy saying development shall take place on this particular site.
Thank you. It was just the fact that by putting in 500, it did seem to be slightly prescriptive, but I accept what you say. Just now that to the point of possible error, PM6, page 179 of Appendix 4, which are the maps. Yeah. It shows the major housing developments taking place. Now, in Wirksworth, you've put in allocated dwellings of 771 on that map, but in fact, the land allocations, Middle Peak Quarry 645 and Middleton Road increased to 150 gives you a total of 795. The 771 is the combination of the former figures of 126 that were on Middleton Road. I just obviously being worked with resident, I picked that up. Am I right or not?
You are absolutely right, Councillor Radcliffe, and we will make that amendment before these are published on Monday.
Great,
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for all your answers.
Thank you. Councillor Bull.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I would like to just say thank you to all the officers that have worked on this, particularly Paul Wilson, and thank the residents of all towns and villages that will be affected in one way or another through it. But hopefully once the plan is in place, then obviously we'll all stand a better stead of having the developments that are needed and not just thrust upon us anyhow. But the one thing I would just like to ask is on page 20, the MM17, to do with why has the Strove Tide part been taken out. It's been struck through, and I just wondered what the reason is for that.
Taken out at the request of the Strove Tide Committee.
Right, thank you.
Councillor Flitter.
Thank you, Chair. Well, Councillor Rose used the word frustrated in his opening speech, and I have to say that right through this whole procedure, I've been very frustrated, and so have the people of the area, especially around Matlock and Tansley. Proposals put forward by a council should be there to encourage and stimulate debate, and as far as I can see, all it's taken so far is a feeling of anger amongst many residents, and I think that could have been well avoided. I have to say that I totally agree and support two speakers tonight, Councillors Vicky Rains and Ian Strange from Tansley, because I fully support that Tansley has been put in the wrong hierarchy, and we've been banging the drum about that for quite some time, and I also believe that they are right in the fact that the rest of Derbyshire Dales outside the Peak Park could have lessened the pressure on the small towns within Derbyshire Dales. After saying that, I've just got 4 points that I want to raise. One, and I'll stick with Tansley first, and that is an issue of the Fate Field, which is to be put back, reinstated as open land. But was any reasonable explanation given to the parish council as to why this was included? Because this land was never ever available because it's owned and managed by the parish council. I know they had a letter, but there was no reasonable explanation, and I think this council is remiss in not explaining to the parish council why that was included in the first instance. The second point that I want to just question is the Cavendish Road, Gritston Road development. And again, we've been banging the drum for many months, disagreeing with that development as a whole.
Yeah, I'd like to declare a pecuniary interest in the Cavendish site, and I'll be leaving the meeting.
Thank you. So, are you declaring an interest? No, you're not. And Councillor Statham.
Yes, Chair. I too have a pecuniary interest in Cavendish Road, so I'll be leaving the meeting as well.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll resume once you've. Thank you. Thank you very much. Councillor Fitter, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. On this occasion, I'd just like to question what the officers mean with the type of facilities within the local centre that is proposed up at Cavendish Fields and Gritston Road. Because, and who decides what is proportionate to the needs of people? And has any study been done on what traffic will be created by any extra facilities within that area? Because I know certain areas of Matlock get a lot more traffic because of the shops which aren't totally in the town centre but are well used, and it does cause problems. The third point I'd like to just bring up is the map of Matlock settlement area on page 10. And I'd just like it clarifying, why is Harford Darley Dale within the Matlock settlement boundary? In fact, the report states that Darley Dale is 2.5 miles, and I know you're talking about the service centre of Darley Dale, but Darley Dale abuts Matlock, and even the Ark is in Darley Dale. And there must be a reason for that, but I fail to understand. And lastly, it's Corder Quarry. Now, we've heard about the withdrawal of Snitton Fields, and there's been good arguments for that, but we've had Corder Quarry undeveloped for the last 20 years that I know of. And it's got to be affordable. It's got to be within the economic development. But what happens to the deliverability of the housing within the plan if Corder yet again cannot be developed because Snitton Fields are taken out of the equation? And if developed without affordable housing stock, as is proposed, then where will the new housing be built for young people? Because it certainly won't be in Matlock because we have no more housing. And the young people of Matlock deserve the chance to have some housing available. That's it, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. In regard to the first point, the fate field, certainly Mrs. Rains has had detailed explanation relating to this matter because she submitted a Freedom of Information request, but it's quite simply a situation whereby when the plan was originally drafted, there was no identified public open spaces for protection. The intention at that time was that all open spaces would be safeguarded by a very general policy. Later iterations of the plan changed that position, whereby it was decided that we would revert back to the approach taken in the existing local plan, and key significant open spaces would be protected in the plan moving forward. And that's the reason why the fate field, alongside other sites at the Meadows, site at Brassington and the like, have been reintroduced. So it is merely reinstating the exact same policy position that existed prior to the early iterations of the local plan. There's no other reason. These sites were never identified for any other form of development. It was just a change in approach to their protection. In regard to Cavendish Road and Gritstone Road and the issue of local facilities, the examination in public spent a full day on Matlock sites, and there was detailed discussion on this particular site, and the facility which the developers are looking at is in the form of a local convenience store, the scale of which would be determined through the planning application, but it would be very much along the lines of the sort of convenience stores that operators such as Tesco's and Sainsbury's Metro type arrangements operate. The traffic implications of that development have been taken into account in the traffic studies, and they have been modelled, and the highway engineers are very much aware of those proposals which are likely to come forward in the form of an application. In regard to the issue of Matlock settlement boundary, the settlement boundaries are not intended to reflect parish or ward boundaries. However, there was again detailed debate at the inquiry, and that change to the boundary has very much been requested by the inspector, who felt that there was very close relationships in terms of the built form of the settlement between Matlock and Darley-Dale, such that the boundary should be extended in that particular locality. And finally, regarding Corder Quarry, Corder Quarry is an existing commitment within the local plan. The dwellings have been assumed to be a commitment and therefore have relieved pressure on other allocations elsewhere in the district. The affordable housing requirement is clearly set out in the emerging plan, and the policy is that 30% affordable housing would normally be required, subject to issues of viability, and that applies to all key strategic allocations being brought forward.
Thank you. Councillor Swindell.
Thank you, Chair. Two questions, if I may, please. And the first one is just to press for further clarification on the first question and answer that was given to Councillor Ratcliffe regarding the OAN. I'm sorry if I should know the answer to this. With the OAN now looking as though it's going to be reduced, if that's given the green light by the inspector, we're told that there is the possibility that he may reduce the site allocations. If the inspector is happy with the reduced OAN but doesn't recommend reduction in the site allocations, when this comes back to the council, is that something that this council can decide to do at a later date?
No. No, because at this point you are looking to bring forward a local plan based upon an independent inspector considering all of the evidence and identifying what a sound local plan looks like in the context of this district. So you will receive an inspector's report which will make recommendations as to the acceptance of those main modifications. If you choose to ignore them at that point, you cannot adopt the plan.
Thank you. Second question, Chair, if I may, is regarding the 6-week public consultation. Should we approve this recommendation tonight and we go out to a 6-week public consultation, what strategy will we adopt for that public consultation? The reason I ask, obviously there's been considerable interest in the past. I know that some people, members of the public, have got downhearted and given up. But I believe that for them this could be the last chance to state their case against site allocations and so forth. So how will this council be adopting that communication strategy? And will it be, or could it be, very similar to when somebody has previously commented on a planning application where we write to them and make them aware of amendments or a new application that's coming forward where they're basically invited for their comments again? Would we be adopting any measures like that?
Well, Chairman, the first point I want to reiterate is at this stage people can only comment on the modifications. There are no modifications proposed which seek to change the allocations, so we are past that point in time. But in terms of the approach to be taken, subject to council approval this evening, letters will start to go out tomorrow and Friday, notifying everybody who is on the council database who's ever expressed an interest in the local plan, which is a couple of thousand. So it'll either be by hard copy letter or email where we have email addresses. Documents will be made available in public offices and libraries and also online, and there will be media releases issued next week to draw people's attention to where they can find the documentation on the council website.
Thank you very much. Councillor Wilde.
Thank you. I fully support the recommendations and I echo the thanks to members of the public and the officers. I would just like to come back on a point that Mr Ewart made. We have a very good record with affordable housing. In fact, it was reported at the recent C&E meeting that in 17-18 we'll be building just over 70 houses, and in up to 2021 there will be in excess of 350 affordable houses built in the district. So as a district council we do very well with affordable houses.
Thank you very much. Councillor Furness.
Thank you, Chair. I partially asked Mr Wilson this question before the meeting, but it's expanded a bit, and it may be as well for other councillors to hear this. In MM30, we originally had at least 30% affordable housing in a scheme, and that's been altered to simply a straight 30% affordable housing in the scheme. Whereas in MM31, it's saying that open market housing should not be more than 50% of total number of houses in the scheme. So it begs the question about the other 20%. And presumably, is that related to community infrastructure?
It's actually two separate issues. The first issue regarding the affordable housing threshold, there was a significant amount of evidence produced at the examination on issues of viability across the district, and viability does differ significantly across the district. However, the evidence indicated that a minimum of 30% was achievable in all areas. Now, the inspector considered that the deletion of the words "at least" was required, because otherwise that would require the submission of viability statements in respect of every single planning application, and those statements would need to be assessed by the District Council in every single case. Now, the inspector felt that given that 30% was a healthy requirement for affordable housing based on the evidence, it also enabled the introduction of community infrastructure levy, that the policy should be simplified to give that as a definitive threshold. In terms of the second point, that's dealing with exception site housing, and this is an acknowledgement of the fact that there are villages throughout the district whereby there is a need for affordable housing, but sites haven't yet come forward because there may not be the value in the site, there may be landowners who are not prepared to release land. So what this policy does, it gives the opportunity to release exception sites for affordable housing with a degree of cross-subsidy introduced to make a development which on the face of it may be unviable, more viable and more attractive to a landowner to release their land for affordable housing. So that policy will actually encourage delivery of affordable housing across the district.
Thank you. I haven't got anyone else down. Councillor Slack, do you want to say something further?
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank Paul Wilson and Mike Hayes and all this team and all the speakers who've taken part in this long discussion over many, many months. So thank you all for it. In regard to on page 54, I think there's a misstatement made. It's on page 54, EC4K. It's land at Main Street, Middleton, by Works for it's industrial, about the industrial land. This access from Main Street has a weight restriction, and the main entrance is off Porter Lane, Middleton. So this needs altering, really. It's a mistake. On to Sandy Hill Park. It's Sandy Hill Park.
Yes, the site is not in dispute. It's perhaps the way it has been described.
And I want to clarify that they can't come in through that.
Yes,
it's a weight restriction.
That is acknowledged.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, yeah. Councillor Hobson.
I note we're here to consider the modifications from the inspector, and it's not an opportunity to revisit the plan. So I'd like to thank Paul for being so eloquent with his answers tonight, and to thank all the residents who've come to speak. Thank you.
Councillor Ratcliffe.
Thank you for allowing me to come back, Chair. Yeah, it will be a brief one. I'm sure Paul will handle it very deftly, as he always. We spoke a moment or two ago about housing development and the numbers that will be considered for the 30% affordable, having risen from 10 to 11. Now, it just shows you the complexity of this, because I've just been reading in the second appendix at AM 59 the glossary of major development, housing developments of 10 or more dwellings are being classed. Would it not be more pertinent, in light of that move from 10 to 11 on the percentage affordable, to make this as 11 or more as the definition of major? Or am I further complicating it?
There are two separate issues. That definition is a definition which actually comes out of the relevant order, which supports the General Permitted Development Order. So that is a statutory government definition, whereas the affordable housing issue of 11 or more reflects the fact that you cannot seek affordable housing contributions on schemes of 10 units. So they are different, yeah.
Okay, the recommendation, which is to approve the schedule of the main modifications, the additional modifications, and the further modifications that Mr. Wilson outlined earlier verbally, as well as approving the schedule of the policy maps, and finally to give the corporate director the authority, delegated authority to respond. Sorry.
Can I just refer to Mr. Wilson? Apparently on the Spout Lane, on the recreation land.
Sorry, is that something just been handed, or is that...
Well, I was aware of it. I have got a note of it, but I didn't know whether we were going into debate, but obviously moving on. But the Spout Lane land, the recreation land, once before, on one of the maps, they included garden land in with the area. And it looks as if they have done it again. I had got a note of it, but it has just, yes, that has been just passed. But I have got it on my piece of paper to query. But I was going to speak in general rather than just do the questions, which I thought we would go on to some debate, which we appear not to be.
Well, I went through the list of everyone who wanted to speak that had given an indication to speak. It's been moved and seconded.
You asked for questions, and it hadn't moved to debate. So
as soon as it's moved, it's in debate. So
I will accept your word, but you did ask for questions, so that's fine. But there is a problem on that because it does include privately owned land, and this has been raised.
I think Mr.
before.
Wilson's just going to respond to you on that issue.
Chairman, I'm aware of that issue. We will double check that plan before it gets produced on Monday.
The recommendation has been proposed and seconded. Can we move to the vote? All those in favour? And who's doing the counting? Yeah, and those against? Abstentions?
20 in favour with 1 abstention.
The motion's therefore carried. Thank you very much to everyone that's attended and particularly members of the public who have spoken. Thank you very much and a safe journey home.